Tatsmewi, Tats Halaf, Tats Lahain, Katsiao Yao Wakalo, Katsiao Yao, Inim Lautiwa, Inem Winiktuas, Atit Watit, Soyapa Winiktuas, Tai Simpson, Inwas, Vimipu Ayat, Inem Nixasa, Hiwas Timina Ilk Ilkanich. Good afternoon, good day, good morning, wherever you are located. Thank you, Creator, for bringing us together in a good way. Thank you, friends, for being here and joining us for the third week. I told you that my name is the storyteller in my Indigenous language and that I am a citizen of the Nimipu Nation of the, or otherwise known as the Nez Perce tribe. Before I begin, let us acknowledge that we are on the ancestral territories of the Burns Paiute tribe of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, the Fort McDermott Paiute, the Shoshone Tribes of Nevada, the Shoshone Paiute Tribes, and the Shoshone Bannock Tribe of Idaho. Idaho is also built on the ancestral territory of the Kootenai Nation, the Coeur d'Alene Nation, and the Nez Perce Nation. I am very excited to have you all here. This was a very important addition to our conference this year. I want to give you a little history of how this conference came about and how this particular panel came together. Back in October, November of last year, there were some policymakers partnering with some tribal leadership around how we can address the missing and murdered Indigenous women's epidemic in our region and across the country. It lended itself to a couple of conversations about how we can write legislation to immediately recognize it. But there were a few of us in community who work in research, who work in as advocates, who work as community organizers, who wanted to slow down a little bit to make sure that we were receiving feedback from relevant tribal leadership, stakeholders, matriarchs and elders in each of these tribes to ensure that we're providing the right legislation, that we are naming exactly what it is our community needs to mitigate this violence in our communities. That brought us to a summit on December 19th of last year. Two of our participants here today on the panel were a part of that discussion, and I have deep gratitude that they're coming back to join us for this discussion today. That summit illustrated a gap in how we gather data in Indigenous communities when it comes to our missing and murdered. I also identified a gap in interagency relationships and collaboration. Some of our questions, we'll talk about that this afternoon. And it also brought to mind like how, what resources are our tribal law enforcement missing as well? And then what partnerships can be built between advocacy programs and law enforcement for us to address this issue. Again, the stance that we're taking in looking at missing and murdered Indigenous people is a lens of anti-oppression, a lens of intersectionality. We are not divorcing issues of race or oppression or marginalization from the violence that takes place and adversely affects our tribal communities in Idaho and across the United States. So that's why the discussion, all of the discussions and all of the panels and all of the presentations up to this point are all help us to create a tapestry of solutions, a tapestry of contextualization, a tapestry of history. And that's important for us to have community-focused solutions that move us forward from this place. We have heard from several presentations that Indian country exists within a complex web of jurisdictions. And as a result, several obstacles stand in the way of violence prevention and response for many of our Indigenous communities. So this panel that we've brought together today includes panelist Harold, AKA Hooley Scott from the Nez Perce Tribal Police. He is the chief of police there. Sam Abrahamson is the chief of police for the Coeur d'Alene tribe. We have Doug Hart representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And then Tanea Parmenter from the Missing Persons Clearinghouse at the Idaho State Police Agency. So I'm very thankful for those four. We did have an invitation extended to the Boise Police Department. However, there is a case that took them away from us this morning. And so we understand that responsibility takes priority. I would like to get us started by inviting each of you to tell us who you are, tell us about your work and experience with missing and murdered Indigenous people in your community, and then we can start to dig into some of these questions. Tanea, do you mind if I start with you?
Sure, Ty, thank you very much. My name is Tanea Parmenter. I'm the Missing Person Clearinghouse Manager. I'm also the Amber Alert Coordinator for Idaho. My role in Missing Person is collecting all of the missing person entries that are entered into the what we call NCIC system, the National Criminal Information System, that all law enforcement agencies have access to. I take that data that's entered and publish posters and post it on the website. I also do distribution on my new Facebook page. And then whenever there's a need for an Amber Alert, we push that out to our communities via the wireless emergency alert system and also our Twitter feed.
Hey, thank you. That was new to me. I didn't realize you had a social media set up for disseminating missing persons. So that's great to know. Already learning something. We're about 10 minutes in. Sam, if you can hear me, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to us?
Hi, Sam actually had to step out. This is Jason Robinson. I'm the criminal investigator for the Coeur d'Alene Tribe. Sam will be joining us here in a little bit, so I'm going to take his place temporarily, if that's okay.
That's great, Jason. Thank you for being here.
So I've been with the Coeur d'Alene Tribe for about 14 years. I took over criminal investigations once Sam was promoted to the chief of police. So I currently run investigations, including any major crimes and narcotics.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that you're taking his place in the meantime. Huli, how about you? If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to us.
Good morning. Guess you can all hear me.
We can hear you.
Good deal. I've worked law enforcement since 1983. Worked at the Bureau of Indian Affairs until '97. Became chief of police at the Coeur d'Alene Tribe, and basically stepped down in 2002 and was director of security, and returned to role 2016 back to chief of police. The guy that actually runs this operation for this program is Dan Taylor, and he is actually in a investigation. So I'm actually sitting in to answer any questions you guys may have today, or any kind of assistance I may be able to help. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me, Ty.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Thanks for inviting me, Ty.
Oh, of course. Good to have you. Fun facts, y'all, since I'm a storyteller, I'm also a boxer. And at one point when I was living on the res, Huli helped me to be a better boxer while I was living there. So I got to learn from old school boxers at home, which was great. Who do I have left? Doug, thanks for joining us. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit? I'm sorry, I didn't remember your title at the FBI, so that might actually be worth stating too.
Oh, okay. I am a supervisory special agent. I've been with the FBI for a little over 25 years. About 13 years of that time has been spent working in and around a couple of different Indian reservations. I spent over 7.5 years assigned to the Nez Perce Indian Reservation. And then at the present time, I do a lot of work on the Fort Hall Reservation as well as Duck Valley from time to time. I really appreciate being invited to participate in this discussion. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in talking about these issues and looking for solutions to these problems collectively. So thanks for having me.
Of course, Doug, it's good to have you again. I appreciate you being here. So the four high-level topics that I wanted to touch on as we discussed today are issues of jurisdiction, issues of communication, issues around process, and the history of law enforcement and the relationship with Indian country. So, and it's oddly enough, the questions that I curated from the community all fell within to one of those four things. I did try to email you these questions ahead of time, and we'll just sort of augment them and conversationally address them. I do want you to know that in addition to the questions that were submitted, we also had several expressions of frustration, and it's important to name that for the community. I don't speak for any of the families. I don't speak for swaths of Indigenous people, but I do want to convey that there is a great deal of frustration from families who are impacted by missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. They are survivors, they are survivor families. And so that I just want to convey that to all of you. And I'm sure that you know in your roles, but I also want to do my due diligence and convey those frustrations as well. There were specific points of feedback about how the process is unclear when they submit a missing persons report. There's also a perception in the community that sometimes nothing is done. And I would likely attribute that to lack of communication. So having these conversations is difficult, and it's definitely necessary to name the critical feedback while at the same time acknowledging the effort that we are making to end this violence in our community. The biggest question that comes up from community members is what happens when a case or an incident of somebody missing or murdered is unclear between jurisdictions. How does that process usually look? And Huli, because I know that you are having to coordinate with the Nez Perce County, the 4 other counties that our reservation covers, our reservation itself, City of Lewiston, all of the city police, like what is the process when a case crosses jurisdiction? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, fortunately, at this time, we have not had to deal in that, but you're very right. We have several, we have 4 jurisdictions within our reservation, well, actually 5. We have a little portion of Latah County. Anytime those things are received, actually, we have been working really hard to work on communication with those programs to make sure that we are able to get the information out. Within our program, we hold a meeting with the jurisdictional counties within our reservation to put out information as far as anything that we can help and assist. One of the big things we did have a missing person filed as of yesterday, but it was out of our jurisdiction. And how it had came to our play is that the person that was missing happened clear back in 1980, and it's a relative to a tribal member within our reservation. So we are now currently working with the jurisdiction. Matter of fact, right after this meeting, I am to meet with the adjacent county to assist with the information that I had received on a cold missing person case back in 1980, and information that we have seems pretty tight at this time. But yeah, there are those issues, but at the same time, I believe we're making those communications between other jurisdictions just by having meetings at least every other month that we meet and we share information back and forth. So we haven't had the total issue at this time of working in this in-person case within our jurisdiction, but we have assisted others. I hope I answered
That's great. I want to pose that similar question to Jason, since you work in a similar capacity for the Coeur d'Alene tribe. But can you tell us also, so that same question, what's the process when a case is unclear between jurisdictions, but who can the family expect to hear from as follow-up when those situations happen?
So yeah, we've actually been blessed with a good surrounding area where the agencies around us collaborate pretty well. So if we have something come up to where we have a missing person, there's not a whole lot of time that goes by between the time we are taking the initial report and contacting whatever possible other jurisdiction that we may go into. Similar to Hooley, we have a current case we're working that has crossed into 2 or 3 jurisdictions this year, and it's an old case, but luckily the jurisdictions around us are familiar with it, and the communication is there, and I think that's the most important thing. As far as the kind of the second part of that, the process with the families and what they can expect. The beginning of an investigation can be pretty dynamic until we know exactly where it's going to take us. So they may be contacted by a couple different investigators, maybe a couple different departments. What we try to do is we try to hone in on a couple investigators or a couple primary people that will stay in communication with the family and kind of carry it through the entire process, whether it stays in our jurisdiction or whether it moves into another one, just because we think that that's important to have that contact and that familiarity between us. So we haven't really run into any issues as far as crossing into other jurisdictions and communicating through the process of working through missing people. I don't know if that answers your complete question or not.
No, that was helpful. And I think I'm going to pivot a little bit then too. So thank you, Jason. I'm going to pivot a little bit to you, Doug, because if you recall, we did have a conversation about this back during the summit. And I recently spoke with a survivor's mother, or sorry, a victim's mother. And she ran me through like 6 or 7 different jurisdictions regarding her son. So Doug, if you can tell me, what has your experience been about addressing these jurisdictional issues? What has been successful? What are the obstacles? Can you give us a little light on those?
Sure. For us and the time that I've spent in Idaho and elsewhere, when there's a crime that's committed or when someone goes missing, one of the first things we try to determine very quickly is the jurisdictional issue. And we have a set of basically a matrix that we use with our tribal law enforcement partners to determine jurisdictional issues. Sometimes they are unclear, but for me personally, I've never let a jurisdictional issue prevent the FBI from assisting, and going forward with a case, because the jurisdictional issues can always be addressed after the fact if there's an immediate need for the investigation to go forward. I think one of the things that is a frustration and a complication is that when you have a missing person, I don't think the issues are so much between the Nez Perce Tribal Police Department and Nez Perce County, but what happens when that person moves to Los Angeles, or what happens when that missing person was, last seen in Atlanta or somewhere very, very far away. And that's where I think this federal task force that the president has convened will hopefully bring some benefit to this problem, because in my experience, the FBI in Idaho, in this region, has very good relationships with our state and city and county and tribal partners. So I don't think that's so much where the problem exists as much as it is when that case goes far away to other states where we don't have those relationships, where it's hard to pick up the phone and get a hold of a specific person. It's hard to make a determination of how those agencies many states away may be addressing that matter, or if they're addressing it at all, depending on whether it's a priority for them. So I acknowledge it's tremendously frustrating for the family members, particularly as it relates to a missing person. But I feel comfortable, as Huli and Jason said, I agree with them that we do a pretty good job of working together and not letting a jurisdictional issue become a hindrance to conducting the investigation.
Thank you. Then this actually kind of lends itself to a process-oriented question, but before I move into that, Tanea, did you have anything to add about interagency collaboration when addressing a missing persons case? Is there anything that families or survivor families should know?
Oh, sorry, Ty, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, so just building off of the jurisdiction in Idaho, I get to work with a lot of agencies, or all of our agencies, and we've done a great job as far as communicating jurisdiction wise. One thing that when I do teach my missing persons classes to my agencies is we really need to focus on building that relationship with our victims' families and assigning a victim, like a victim witness coordinator, or somebody to be that liaison between the law enforcement agency and the family. The family are dealing with a traumatic event, and they need to have somebody that can give them that support, but be able to communicate clearly to law enforcement, and law enforcement communicate to them, and that helps filter that communication and build that bond. So if we can figure out a way to get these victim witness coordinators assigned, we don't have a ton of them in Idaho, but get them assigned to a family so that they can carry on through the investigation, and then help them through that whole court process if needed, and be with them the whole step, depending on the way that case goes, would be something that I would see as a great improvement for our state.
I think you're exactly right. That's actually some of the feedback that we received from the family. So thank you for naming that. It's good to hear from it that the agencies, you all believe that you are working together, but what happens on the outside is that families and survivors don't see that. So having somebody be a liaison between these folks who are adversely affected by violence would be incredibly helpful, because it's like, you're right, in crisis, like where can they find answers? So that brings us to the process question. So for each of your agencies, what is the process from the point of them filing the missing persons report to when the case either escalates to the Department of Justice or escalates to criminal conviction? And I know that feels almost as if it's a remedial question, and it can be different agency by agency, but there are a lot of families who just don't know what happens when somebody goes missing and what happens after it's reported. So Doug, can we start with you on that question?
Sure. So one of the challenges with, we string this together for missing and murdered Indigenous persons. Obviously, if there's a murder, then we're very aware that a crime has taken place and an investigation is underway. There are times with missing persons that becomes difficult because we don't know that a crime has taken place. And so that's one of the challenges I hope people will understand from a law enforcement perspective is we'll make initial inquiries and conduct an investigation and make a determination, try to make a determination as to the location of that person. But in terms of process, the first step in the process is trying to determine if a crime has taken place, or if it's an issue of somebody who may be just in danger, like a child runaway or something along those lines. That's obviously still something that law enforcement would respond to. In that initial response, that initial process is when the case is opened, both at the tribal and federal level. As we work through the information and conduct the investigation and collect information to either prove a crime has been committed or to locate and determine the safety of an individual who is missing, we have several things that we do in the course of those investigations. We always involve, to Tanea's point, and I appreciate her bringing that up, from the FBI's perspective, I can tell you that we have a full-time and have had for many years, a very experienced full-time victim witness coordinator who lives and works in Pocatello to service the Shoshone-Bannock tribe, and we also have a full-time victim witness coordinator located in Coeur d'Alene to service the Coeur d'Alene tribe and the Nez Perce tribe. So those individuals are the liaison with the family when the FBI is involved in an investigation. If a person has been arrested and charged with a crime, the victim witness coordinator will notify the family of all of the court proceedings. We'll be at court with the families. We'll make sure they're aware of what's happening. They also act as a liaison to some degree with the United States Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office also has their own victim witness coordinators. So I think the process, Ty, is much clearer once an individual has been charged with a crime, and that's probably, I may be misspeaking, but I think the frustrations are probably more during the investigative phase where the answers aren't as apparent and law enforcement is still trying to make a determination as to what's happened. And the communication with the family is a little bit more difficult during that process because law enforcement is not in a position to reveal the details of the ongoing investigation. And I know that's a big frustration for family, but the fact of the matter is there are just certain things that the investigators during the course of an investigation are unable to share. I hope we make our best efforts to share what we can, to give as much information as we can to the families, but sometimes these investigations, we just had one on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation where the individual had been missing for 18 months before we were able to before we were able to break the case, and we ultimately arrested a number of individuals and recovered the body of that individual. But it was a year and a half for that family of not knowing, and it took law enforcement that period of time to finally solve the case. So many of these cases are very, very difficult investigations, and information isn't readily available on a frequent basis.
Thank you for sharing that, Doug. I appreciate it. Huli, is it similar at a tribal law enforcement level? And I think it's really interesting from a tribal law enforcement level because we all know each other, right? Like we all have each other's cell phones and we know where each other lives. Like, how do you feel about that process of investigation? Like, what should families be aware of when that takes place in our community, for example?
Well, unfortunately, we did have, I walked in back into Chief of Police in 2016, and I wasn't quite into my office and actually knew of a missing person case. I was actually actively active within our program. A family member had came in and talked to me, and in that process told me about this missing person, and I knew nothing of it, so I had to pull a case up. And in that time, one of the weak points that, like you're talking about, a lot of people do say is that communication. So we have to close that communication gap. And one of the things that I brought to my officer's attention was, had anybody ever contacted that family during this time of investigation? Which time I learned that there was no contact. So the changes in the program is that anytime we have any incident with anybody, whether it's any type of incident, that we will follow up and let the victim know, or the person reporting, of how we're following up or how we're taking care of the case. I felt pretty bad for the family. Within the time frame that we had then worked on the case, after I was notified, it was probably a good hard 2 months of trying to figure out what happened. We were able to, fortunately, a hunter had located some remains, and we were able to close that case. Which time I did notify the family right away. I did tell them that upon more investigation that I would be able to legally give them that information, that it was their next of kin. But I was positive at that point. But the family was very, very happy that we were communicating with them, that we were following up at that point. So I do understand the frustrations of family when we have a missing person and there's no communication between that. So that was my opening door here. And since then, we've been working really hard just within our program. I'm not going to blame any other programs. Both our own program, we're learning to communicate with family members. And the process that Doug had talked about is basically the same. Like I said, there was certain things that I could not divulge to the family until there was a certainty and everything was confirmed to the lab. At which time, when it was, then I did contact family and let them know. So we are developing that. Communication is a big thing, but the process is the same as the feds do the same as we do.
Thank you.
Now,
Thanks, Huli. Sam, I'm interested to hear about what that's like. Sorry, not Sam, Jason, or Sam, if you're back. What's that like on the Coeur d'Alene reservation? So it sounds like communication is complicated with families. How do you see that improving? What has worked in the past? What doesn't work? What can families expect around communication during an investigation?
So communication obviously is the most important thing, whether it's to the partnering investigators, victim advocacy, the family. I feel like we have pretty good communication with our community. We tend to take a little different approach when we open an investigation into a missing person. The majority, like Doug was saying, the majority of our missing person cases obviously come out, and a lot of them are juvenile runaways. A lot of them are end up not being, what they may look like at the beginning. So we kind of come out initially and we try to determine if a crime has been committed, is the person in danger, and we have good communication with our local FBI agent that works with us, and even though we may not have a criminal, like a crime off the start, we still include them so they're aware of the entire situation. So if it does develop into something else later, they don't have to play catch up. We also include, I'm probably a little biased, but we probably have the best victim advocacy program and stop the violence program around. I can't say enough about them, and we utilize them immediately, and they help us both with, following leads and communicating with the families. you know, we run into issues sometimes where the family, we may have, obviously it's a tight community, and they may not fully have trust in us. And that's a big hurdle that we hit sometimes. And so then that's when we will use the other resources we have, such as our Stop the Violence program or another victim advocate, to try to, you know, communicate things that we need to communicate to them. But as far as improving it, I think the most important thing, honestly, is time. It just takes time to become part of your community and to gain that trust. And like Doug said, and like Hui said, one of the biggest things we do run into is not being able to give direct answers. So if we have a case where we may end up with 100 different leads, and I'm not going to want to go to that family and give them 100 different directions we're going, because it's most likely going to frustrate them and possibly give them false hope, or possibly cause a stress that, you know, isn't necessary. So it's kind of a difficult thing to balance how much we communicate or the information we provide to the families. Nevertheless, we want that open communication. We want them to know that we have an open door. We have an open, anytime they can call us, anytime they can come in, and we will never push them to the side. We will always be there for them. And I guess just relaying that is kind of the hardest part, through a process that isn't easy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I will echo and underscore that working with Bernie at Stop Violence for the Coeur d'Alene Tribe is absolutely incredible. She's a mentor of mine and does some incredible work in the community. So you are lucky to have her, Jason.
Yeah, she is the best in the country as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, she's definitely, she's an auntie now. You bring up a great question. And it actually echoes a question that we just received. I'm going to try to avoid taking questions on the fly, but this one actually is in the same vein. So Jason, I'm going to stay with you, and then I'll move into you in just a moment, Tanea. So is there ever an instance when the tribal police department will say, we can't help you, and then will the FBI pick it up, or vice versa?
As far as a missing person case?
Yeah, I think in this, like in any criminal capacity, in any act of violence, any criminal act, I think that, because that applies across several incidences, I think.
I will never, and I don't think any seasoned investigator would ever use the words, we can't help you. That doesn't exist in our vocabulary. There's going to be instances where I've had actually several of these where someone has been living in our jurisdiction, and they will come to us either because we're the closest agency or they trust us. Whatever the reason is, they'll come to us about a case that's possibly happening. I just had one in Oregon on the Warm Springs Reservation, where they ended up being a juvenile runaway, but they didn't know at first, and they came to me. And I'm not going to, whether it's a surrounding agency, whether it's a different state, I'm not going to tell them we can't help them. No, so that would never be said. What we'll do is we'll obviously try to link up and provide someone that they can talk to and work them through the process. And even then, we would still act as liaisons, or, I mean, we're still going to communicate with them. We're not going to just turn them away and send them a different direction. We're going to obviously explain to them possible jurisdiction issues. However, we're not going to tell them we can't help them. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Okay. Thank you for offering that. I hope it did touch on the question that we had from the community member. And this is a family that I've been honored to spend some time with and discuss the case for their particular family and their community. And in full disclosure for all of you, what I'm hearing from you and what they are perceiving are not in alignment. And that's actually one of my goals in hosting this panel, is how can we get the community and law enforcement stakeholders in alignment in addressing missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. So that's kind of the high level goal. I know in a short 2-hour window, we can't fix all of the world's problems, but it's worth noting and worth stating that what's happening like you're naming that it's frustrating. You're naming that there is a lack of transparency for the sake of the integrity of the case. I can totally understand that. But in the moment of crisis, there are folks and families who are not receiving it that way. So I just want to name that for families and for survivors if they have joined us today, that I see you and I hear you. Tanea, let's move into you. What do you see as your role in addressing missing and murdered Indigenous people with regards to data collection and even building systems across agencies for data collection? Are you still with us, Tanea? I know that we lost you for a second. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Hi. Yeah. Did you hear my question?
I didn't hear your question. You were breaking out.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. So my question was, how do you see your role in addressing MMIP with regards to data collection and even collaborating about data collection across agencies?
So what the Clearinghouse does is it collects data on all missing persons in Idaho, whether they're on tribal lands or off. The information that we collect is mainly for external dissemination for the public. And then the other information that we collect is for the agency itself. So to support the law enforcement agency with case analysis and maybe investigative process where, especially if it's a case that has gone cold, another set of eyes looking to see if there's some additional resources or help that's available to them when looking for their missing persons case. Also, we have a resource database where families can reach out and say, you know, what's available to my family as far as resources for my missing person or support. We work a lot with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They're great with family advocacy as far as walking you through family law, especially when it's a family abduction, where you have a custodial interference case. They also have a team called Team Adam that sends an investigator out to each law enforcement agency, gives them an extra pair of hands and eyes for free. And that person will, you know, that is an experienced retired law enforcement that has done this over and over many years and has seen many missing persons cases or abduction cases and can help that agency. You know, they're not going to run the investigation, but they will provide support and assistance at no charge. And then they have the Team Hope, where is the families that are dealing with that are family members that are on this Team Hope that have had their child missing and maybe have or have not returned. And so they offer a lot of support to the families that are dealing with these missing child cases or missing persons cases. So we collect that resource database. I'm not an investigator. I don't go out and investigate cases, and I don't have any way to tell an agency what to do or what not to do. But when I go out to teach on missing persons cases and how to deal with missing persons cases, I give the law enforcement agencies resources and tools and ideas for what works and what doesn't work, or what could be a good benefit for them when dealing with these missing person cases.
And just to clarify on the heels of Taisha's and Pamela's presentations yesterday, so you are the Amber Alert coordinator for Idaho. Does that also mean that you are when it comes to Amber Alert in Indian country, you would help us with that? Like if it were about disseminating resources and knowledge to our Native communities specifically?
Yes, and all of our Amber Alerts in Indian country are available right now. So most of the tribal agencies use dispatch services through different counties or through regional dispatch services like Whitcomb up in North Idaho, or a neighboring jurisdiction to offer their dispatch services. And those dispatchers attend my Amber Alert training, and they know how to issue an Amber Alert when it's needed. And it's getting the officers to that Amber Alert training, so know when an Amber's qualified. But yes, that would be the point of contact, making sure that you guys, your agency or your tribal agencies have an Amber Alert plan. But all of them disseminated through the state. Idaho's a great state because we actually have a really good connection that all the tribal law enforcement agencies are connected to our, what we call our state switch. So they can run NCIC and all of our law enforcement hot files and Amber requests and everything like that already. Whereas in other states, and how this came about is there's other states that the tribal agencies didn't have access to that. They didn't have access to those national databases or those tools. And so we're very lucky in Idaho that we do have that with all of our tribal agencies.
Thank you for offering that and for sharing that. That's a good resource to know. I learned a lot from the presentation yesterday. And I think, I mean, my goal as an advocate at the coalition is to help to facilitate collaboration between agencies and between organizations that we learned from the summit, that the coalition and the council and ISP and the tribes and the tribal advocate programs can all work in close proximity to one another, in close collaboration with one another, so that the prevention and response to missing and murdered relatives is the same across the state as much as it can be. And I think that I think that would address the issue of the discrepancy in numbers that we talked about last year at the summit. So for those of you who weren't there, we had determined from the Sovereign Bodies Institute that the number of missing persons reported in Idaho was significantly different than the numbers that Tanea had in the ISP Missing Persons Clearinghouse. And that differential is like 48 in Idaho for sovereign bodies, and then 10 out of ISP. I haven't looked at those numbers recently, but that's where that actually lends, like, segueing into the next question in a really, in a very smooth way. Data is the biggest issue in successfully tracking missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And this is across the state, across Indian country. So Doug, let's start with you. In your role at the FBI and as an investigator, like, is it a hindrance to collect thorough data for us to track? Like, what are the obstacles to getting data and making that data public so that we can all support mitigating this crisis?
So the short answer is yes, it is. So the data helps us to define the size and scope of the problem, and the data helps us to know where we need to allocate resources, and tells us, it helps paint an accurate picture of the problem we're facing. The issue as it relates to missing and murdered Indigenous persons is that there are so many different entities. Just let's take Idaho, for example. We have 44 counties. I honestly don't know how many cities we have within all of those counties. You have state agencies, federal agencies, and then tribal agencies. And each agency, this is the key part in my mind, is there is no one agency that's responsible for collecting the data. The FBI issues each year a very detailed uniform crime report, but the report relies on data that is provided by each individual agency. And so to me, that's the biggest obstacle, is that each agency on its own is responsible for collecting and then subsequently pushing that information forward to the appropriate entities, whether that's the Idaho State Police, because they do a lot of data analysis and collection, or whether that's to the federal realm. But we have to rely on those agencies. And some of them in Idaho, you've got agencies that are, 7 sworn, very, very small. And because they're so small, data collection and data reporting is probably not high on their priority list because they're swamped with the other things that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I guess for me, what it boils down to is we don't really have a national data collection mechanism that puts this all on the same playing field so that we're all seeing the information and getting the information we need as part of addressing this problem. So I don't know what the answer is, Ty, but we rely on each agency, and some do a good job and others don't do any at all.
Thank you for that transparency in that. I'm glad that you named it. It's ultimately what I was alluding to with the question. Thank you for that. Tanea, it sounded like you have something you wanted to add.
Yes, thanks, Ty. So the uniform crime reporting that all of our agencies push up to us at the state, and then we push it to the FBI, is only our county and our cities. The federal or the FBI gave mandates that the tribal agencies are supposed to submit to either BJS or the FBI directly, and bypassing the state in a lot of ways. So we don't even get to see those tribal numbers. However, missing persons is a completely different ball of wax, and we collect that information when they're entered into NCIC, which all tribal agencies in Idaho have access to. So if that tribal agency is not entering that missing person into NCIC, which they absolutely should, and especially if it's a juvenile under the age of 18 and our vulnerable adults under the age of 21, which it's mandated federally that they need to, then we have no way to disseminate that out. And when you said there was a discrepancy between what you had reported for missing persons, Indigenous missing persons, versus what the clearinghouse has, we have everything that the tribal agency puts in there. So if the tribal agency is not putting that information in, then we don't have that information to push out. And so that might be a discrepancy as well, is making sure that those tribal agencies are entering every single person into NCIC, even if it's a person that's been a delayed traveler, because if they push out just a notifying message that that person's missing, there's no way for us to query that. Or if law enforcement has interaction with that person later on, there's no way of knowing that that person has been missing unless they are entered into that database.
Thank you for adding that. I appreciate it. Huli, I want to circle back to you since we.
Are you there?
Oh yeah, was that?
Go ahead.
I'm having a lot of our internet keeps going down, so I'm having a lot of internet connectivity issues. Did you hear everything that I replied to on that?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Tanea? Okay.
I may have to log off and get a different internet connection and log back on.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you when you jump back on. Huli, I was going to circle back to you in a similar process because you're on the ground. What is the data collection process for your officers when there is a crime committed, when somebody goes missing? I know that those two things aren't the same thing, but I'll contextualize this a little bit for folks who are new to this work or who maybe needed some context as to why I ask these questions the way I do. In order to get funding to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people requires us presenting data to policymakers. But if there is no money to get data to present to policymakers, then they tell us that we can't. So it's this giant circle of lack of access to resources because we don't have the appropriate data. And so our work is in trying to facilitate how we can improve data collection. But it also is an ask of law enforcement officers. So Huli, what does that look like for you and your team to collect data around a crime, to collect data around a missing person, and how much of that is available to the community when we start to ask questions?
Pretty much the process is, fortunately, we've been lucky where, again, missing person report had come in. We have taken all the information and submitted that information to our records clerk, who will then actually disseminate it out. If we draw the case and it actually goes to our dispatch, which is WICOM, as a state officer had said, that information is then disseminated out to other agencies. But fortunately on ours, we have had a couple of cases, but they were solved within the day. So we never had to actually go any further. Juvenile cases we had, but it was a cat and mouse game where the person really wasn't missing, was just going from house to house. So we did actually catch up to the relative that was holding the person. But other than that, all that information that we do, our data is received out the officer's report, and our records clerk will then make sure that that information is put out. We've never had to go any further than 24 hours. So that's a good thing. But that's what happens with our data.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then Jason, how about you? Do you have anything to add to that question regarding data collection and then access to it in the aftermath?
Yeah, we do it, I think, similar, maybe a little different. As far as data, we have all of our criminal data and all of our reporting data that goes into a report writing system. That system keeps track of all of our numbers as far as what types of crimes, things like that. When it comes to people, it's a little different. We treat missing people and runaways the same. So we will immediately, once we determine that they are missing or they have run away, we enter them into NCIC, which goes to the state. And then we also, during our regular meetings, we'll update our local FBI office, especially if there's any type of endangered element to that. So everyone gets entered in NCIC once the person is located, which is obviously the most common ending or scenario. It gets removed from NCIC. So there's a form that enters them, it goes through dispatch, and then when they're found or located, whether it's an agency that's local or far off, they will contact us, confirm that that person is still missing due to the NCIC hit, and then they will be removed at that time once they're located. So all that data should be getting funneled through that system with the state. As far as any obviously endangered missing people or anything else, the FBI keeps those stats as well. So I believe they're both being, the data is being collected on two different ends. We also have a reporting that we do through the BIA. I can't remember if it's once or twice a year, and that's one of the topics on the reports that we file with the BIA. And I'm not quite sure where that gets recorded or how that data gets processed, but that's a kind of a third avenue where those numbers go.
Okay. Great, thank you. I appreciate that. You actually brought to mind another question. I'd like, is the investigation process different for a missing person versus a runaway? Because that's actually a frustration that comes out from families. So does that investigation process look different?
No, the initial investigation process is the same. what would change the process is information that comes in during the investigation. We have a lot of older youth that are habitual runaways, and they will basically bounce. I think Hooli touched on that. They'll kind of bounce back and forth between houses. So once it's determined that they're not in danger, let's say we, okay, let me back up a second. Let's say we get a missing person report that comes in. The first thing we're going to do is obviously look at it as a whole and say, okay, are there any circumstances that we need to step this up into a wider range? That would be such as like suspicious circumstance, which I'm not going to go into. That's a whole different topic. But we try to prioritize if it's a missing person, or if it's a runaway or something else. Once that's determined and they're entered in CIC, which we do no matter what, which just gives us one great tool that if that person's contacted by law enforcement anywhere else, we will be notified. Once they're entered into NCIC, we'll continue on with the investigation and location. So where it might change the investigations, where you have a habitual juvenile that runs away, and we'll be getting calls. We'll get a call from a residence. Hey, they're over here. They were here 5 minutes ago. Then we'll get another call the next town over. Hey, they're at our house. Those happen a lot. And unfortunately, we can't always give the attention or the follow-ups on those cases as much as the ones where we have endangerment or unknown circumstances. So no matter what, we're going to actively investigate, but there will at some point become a prioritization of, let's say we have two people go missing at the exact same time, we're going to put more resources into an unknown circumstance or an endangered circumstance versus if it's a juvenile jumping back and forth between friends' houses. But that can be fluid if anything changes during the course of that investigation, such as, okay, now no one's seen this juvenile in a day, then obviously that's going to bump that up into a more priority. And I hate using that word priority, but when you have at sometimes 3, 4, 5 runaway cases that come forward, we have to prioritize them when we only have 1 or 2 officers on at a time.
Thank you for offering that, Jason. I appreciate it. I know Tanea wanted to chime in, so I'll give you room for that now that you're back with us on the phone, Tanea. I do want to acknowledge, though, that you're highlighting an issue about prioritization when it comes to missing folks, like determining what is and isn't a high priority. God, that just feels so dehumanizing to say that. What is or isn't urgent, right? Like this is where so many of our missing and trafficked relatives leave community unwillingly, because they are, like, there's that assumption that they are runaway when they're actually being trafficked. I know that calls into question, like you said, the I don't know what you called it. You said you weren't going to go into it, but just more endangered. But that trafficking piece is also a part of the violence in our communities, and also part of missing and murdered relatives. So I understand the lack of resources to fuel behind keeping the energy up for every case, but it's disheartening, especially when it's a young person who may be susceptible to trafficking. So I want to name that, not necessarily as pushback, but just the perception in the community that if somebody is a runaway, that's also indicative of another issue. And where are they running away to? Are they being trafficked instead of being runaways? I mean, and then it calls into questions like sex work and coercion. So any number of those issues from an advocacy standpoint. Tanea, you had some thoughts you wanted to share?
Yes, thanks, Ty, and thank you for bringing that up of where a quote unquote runaway could go. This is one of my biggest push, is that every call for a missing person needs to have the same attention and reaction. And we need to have, each agency needs to have a policy or plan in place that would address this before that actual call comes in. So a juvenile goes missing, even if that person or that juvenile has gone missing 3, 4, 5, 6 times before, they need to have that same attention brought to them every single time. And I understand resources But there is going to be a time that that agency needs to look at that juvenile runaway and say, okay, this person has ran away 3 times in the last year. And now that we know that, you know, there's some agencies that have a great plan in place when they're with their habitual runaways. And I don't even call them habitual runaways. Every runaway is an endangered runaway. We need to just quit using the term just a runaway. They are an endangered missing person runaway because they don't have the tools and abilities to take care of themselves once they leave, and they don't have the correct decision making skills or abilities to be able to put themselves in a good place. So there's lots of agencies that have a policy. If a runaway or a juvenile goes missing within 3 times within a year, they are assigned an investigator. And next time that they are reported missing, that investigator is called and contacted, and they are assigned that person, that juvenile missing. That then they know the background of that juvenile missing, right? They know the social autopsy of that child. They know who their friends are, and they can intervene and do some early intervention with that juvenile and locate them quicker. So there's lots of different policies and tools that agencies can put in place for these habitual runaways. The other thing with our runaways is we may need to look at doing a social autopsy. A juvenile does not go missing just because they want to go missing. There's lots of times that they're either being pushed out or even being pulled out. They're being coerced out. So what's giving them that push or that pull? What's drawing them from their environment, from their home? And we need to have that social autopsy of that child. And that gets the juvenile justice program involved as far as probation and parole. It gets your law enforcement officers involved. It gets the health social services involved. And we need to have a team on those. So as soon as that child is listed as a high-risk child, that team needs to become involved, and that team needs to understand why is this child missing and what is leading them to become missing. And so my big hope is that an agency would have some sort of policy in place or some sort of early intervention program before we get down to the road of now this habitual runaway has been taken out of state and we can't connect with them because they're now in Las Vegas or in California. And I see this happen with our juvenile runaways because, like I said, I see every person that's entered in, and I can name 3 juvenile runaways right now that are out of state that we can't return or can't locate because they're being trafficked in another state and possibly another country. So that's something that my big push with agencies is figure out a policy that once that juvenile goes missing more than 3 times, now we need to do something. We need to assign that same investigator every single time to return that child and figure out why they're going missing instead of bringing them back into that environment that may be not a good environment for them. Or, you know, figuring out how to get them removed from the thing that's pulling them into that way of going missing.
Thank you, Tanea. I appreciate that. The you know, something that comes to mind, and I will try to reiterate this as much as possible, in our work as advocates, the goal is to end violence. The goal is to put all of you out of a job because, you know, people won't go missing, people won't be murdered, we won't see this adverse effect of violence in our communities. So I'm always looking and appreciative of insight regarding prevention and response, not just the reaction to somebody going missing. How can we empower our communities to stay safe? How do we empower folks who are traumatized to the degree that they're using violence? I mean, those are also hard questions that, I mean, are not necessarily answered in law enforcement agencies, but are something that I would really love to see and hear more of in your work in the future. And I think that that's also part of a coordinated community response. I know Bernie and I have talked about it in the history of her building the Stop Violence program. There was a coordinated community response, and that's absolutely necessary for every one of these instances. I think if somebody is a habitual runaway, what we got to understand why, and I hope that we take that away from the conference in general, but it's just something for us to think on. My sister Melanie, I want to introduce her at this point, like just to kind of give you a glance at her work, but she has been the one to take on the research portion of the HCR 033 legislation that will have her working on her PhD program that discusses what's the word, data collection for missing folks, and then kind of a mapping of jurisdiction in Idaho. And I think that that would be a really useful tool as we start to create solutions, that we start to create response mechanisms that are collaborative across agencies, across the state, and intertribally. I think that that's really important for us to work in a collaborative way amongst our tribes as well. So I just want to name her. If she ever reaches out to you, know that she's part of this work also. Her name is Melanie Fillmore. But she asked a question, what information does a family need to come forward with when they are reporting a missing person? And I think I'll start with you, Jason. Sorry about the landscaping in the background.
What was that last part? I'm sorry.
Give me just 1 second. Like they're landscaping my house right now in the middle of our conference. Perfect. So the question was, what information does a family need to bring forward? What details does a family need to bring forward when they are filing a missing persons case?
Anything that they can. Every little thing helps. It doesn't matter if it seems small at the time. They basically need to bring any possible locations that have been visited, that could be visited, who that person hangs out with, where that person's gone before, any underlying problems that maybe we wouldn't know about, any issues within their life, basically anything. There's nothing too small that we don't want the family to bring forward when we are working a missing person or runaway case.
And who makes the determination? I guess this becomes a little bit more complicated regarding jurisdiction, so I'm going to put a pin in that for right now. What collaborations do you think are necessary between communities and families and law enforcement to improve communication and to improve some of these processes for response? I know that's a heavy question, but I really feel like we should touch on it a little bit. Huli, if you want to get started, and then I'll move into Doug, because your experience is a little bit different. But Huli, can you tell me what do you think our community needs for improved communication between law enforcement and the families? What collaborations need to take place? And I just muted you, so you might need to unmute yourself.
Am I there now?
You're here now. Thanks.
Oh, I think the biggest thing, again, is just predominantly when we gather information, that we make sure that we communicate that information to our areas of concern immediately. We've had situations where we have assisted other agencies, and as soon as they had notified us, we had gathered the information as they had provided us, and we disseminated out to our program, which time that if we have any reliable or other information that may assist the other programs, we put that out for them. But as far as working with the family and everything, as you know, working in Indian country, the families are usually right there. They try to be right in the middle of the search too. So there's some things that we have to, depending on what the situation is, we have to make sure that we take control and work with them and set up an area for the family. And then we have a communicating officer who usually is one of our investigators. They'll actually do the communication between the search or having a juvenile situation. They will contact the family. But that information is all disseminated if we're looking at juvenile, because we have, again, 5 counties on a reservation. It will be put out to our Whitcomb dispatch at that point.
Okay, thank you. And Doug, can you weigh in on that? What can the community do? What collaborations can we build? What improvements do you see happening to mitigate the lapses in communication between family and law enforcement? Any insight you have would be helpful.
Yeah, Ty, that's a great question, because I think that if we were able to do that successfully, it would be a substantial improvement in many of the frustrations that people feel as it regards this issue. But the key question is how do we do that, and how do the communities do that? If I look at my entire area of responsibility, so I'm responsible for the southern 34 counties in Idaho. So my personnel services 34 counties with a population of roughly 1.3 million people, and I have 10 agents. You know, how do I build those bridges? Now, that's just a bigger picture. We're talking specifically about the Indigenous communities and the various communities that exist within the Indian reservations in Idaho. There's a place where I do think we can have an impact. And when you asked the question, you said, you know, what can the communities do? I can tell you that I would never turn down any invitation to speak with the community or meet with the community to the degree that I can. We try to do outreach for those groups that may be the victims of bias or hate crimes. That's one of our programs. But I would love to see a coming together with the, you know, if it's through the tribal councils or, you know, this is going to sound like a bit of a cop-out, but we are so tapped with the volume of threats and cases and crimes that are incoming to our office that for us to take the lead role in organizing community meetings to improve communication between law enforcement and the community is a difficult additional task. But I can tell you, and I hope I've proven that anytime I get an invitation, I love to participate in these events. And I think that's an area where the community and law enforcement, if we both could work towards, and I don't know what that looks like, whether that's community meetings, or I know one of my agents, when he was assigned to the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, would go and serve lunch to the elders and try to participate in community events so that he became a known entity and had relationships in the community. So we try to do those things on an individual level, but I think your question is more between law enforcement as an entity and the communities as an entity. How do those two, what can we do to bring them together? And I do think that if there is a way to figure that out, we would be a lot further down the road as it relates to this problem.
I think, yes, thank you. Yes, and the question was both on an individual level, or especially if your agents are white and law enforcement officers on an Indian reservation. Like there is already a prejudice there, there's a bias there, there's a significant amount of discomfort and distrust that we should name and that we should acknowledge. So to hear that you had an agent that was doing their best to show up and be seen in community by serving the elders, like that's the advice in any anti-oppression education I'm offering, or any anti-racism education I'm offering. To best serve Indigenous communities, especially as a non-Native person, you have to show up and we have to see you. I do want to shout out and name Huli. When I was living up on the res, you had like community lunches like once a month or once every other month or something, where there was food. Awesome. There's always has to be food, but a few of your officers would show up and you would take questions from the community. You would do it at all 3 community centers up and down the river. And that was really important. So if there are opportunities for that, to continue, I would encourage that, especially around MMIP issues in our community. And I will even call in discussions about substance abuse and drugs that are being trafficked into our communities. Like those are also important issues. And I think that it all correlates. So those conversations should be happening in community. I appreciate that. So yes, Doug, in an official capacity, yes, I would love to see formalized collaboration. I mean, that's ultimately my work. I mean, it doesn't have to be formalized in a way where, you know, it's an official initiative, but I think that formal enough where the community is comfortable collaborating for these particular issues. And I see that as a gap in some of this work that I'm doing. Let's see, that was a conversation that came from a community member also. There was a really interesting question that did come through before I move into some discussions of history and relationships between community and law enforcement. How can mental health professionals be helpful when someone goes missing, especially if it's a client? Is there a way to determine if somebody is a client and needs that help? And Jason, I want to go ahead and ask you, I think you might have a good example because of your work with Bernie, but can you tell us, like, how can a mental health healthcare professional be helpful in your investigations?
Yeah, they can be extremely helpful. In fact, we have a great partnership with our mental health facility here locally. And the way it can be helpful is, I can't remember who touched on it earlier, but getting to the root of the problems of why we have people go missing, or specifically runaways. A lot of counselors will be able to come forward with us. A lot of mental health professionals can come forward, and they can kind of give us a little insight that we otherwise wouldn't have. And I think that really steers us in the right direction on helping not only, you know, locate someone who's missing, but that it also creates a way that we can understand why in a lot of circumstances.
Thank you. Doug, did you find any use in having partnerships with mental health care providers, or does the FBI actually keep their own on staff? That's probably the better question.
No, we don't. You know, for threat assessment and threat evaluation, when we're trying to assess if an individual presents danger to the community, we have some resources there, but no, we don't have, and that's just in terms of law enforcement overall, one of the greatest challenges we face at this particular point in time in all areas that we deal with in law enforcement is a lack of mental health services, and that, you know, when someone goes missing and that person is someone who struggles with mental health issues, a lot of times the services are inadequate or unavailable for those folks. The other issue I think you have to keep in mind is, because of the medical privacy laws that are in place, unless there is a specific exception or circumstance for public safety, a treatment provider will not share information with law enforcement about somebody who is a patient or a client. And so that's an obstacle, because there may be information there that would be helpful to us, but because of patient-client or patient-doctor privileges, they're unable to tell us some of those things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's good to hear that from the outside, we're not the only people that see that there is an opportunity for collaboration for mental health services. That's been a discussion at the national level regarding law enforcement also. Is law enforcement the appropriate response when a mental health incident is actually taking place? So that's definitely a sidebar conversation, but it's good to hear that there are law enforcement officials who can name those things also. And Tanea, you wanted to add a piece to that. Please jump in.
So the main thing that I wanted to add on mental health, what would be really beneficial when we're looking at an aspect of a possible Amber Alert, is finding out either mental health of the suspect or even child. And that will help give us some criteria metrics, because when we issue an Amber Alert, we have to meet certain criteria. And one of those is imminent danger of bodily harm or death. So lots of times, if it's a suspect that is a family member, it's really hard for us to issue an Amber Alert, because we have to articulate imminent harm of the child or death. And if we had some history, mental health history, or possibly, we had a great one earlier this spring, last fall, where a clergy stepped in and said, listen, I'm really concerned for this child because of, and I can't give you the details, but some statements that the parent had made. And now she's taken that parent or that child. And so I'm really concerned. So getting that mental health of that suspect or even the child is great for articulating death when we want to issue an Amber Alert.
Thank you for that. And Tanea, really quick, you actually just brought to mind a great question. What are the criteria for Amber Alert? If you can just kind of highlight those. I know that could be its own training session, but for those of us who don't know or who haven't used the system, what are the criteria for issuing an Amber Alert?
Right. So the first one is the child is under the age of 17 years or younger. And then some are criteria and some are suggested. The second one is it's a known or believed to be known abduction. And the third is the child is in imminent danger of bodily harm or death. And then we need to have sufficient information of the child or the suspect or the vehicle that they're traveling in to get that word out. Because if we're just looking for a child with a nondescript information, eyes, hair, height, weight, we're going to get tons of phone calls. So it's not going to be an effective communication or push out to the community. And then the other is within 12 hours. And that's the suggested criteria, because anywhere in our state, if you are in Idaho, within a few hours, you can be outside of our state. So if law enforcement believes that that suspect and that child are no longer in Idaho, we may not issue the Amber Alert there, but I will reach out to that other state that that child or suspect is in and ask them to issue an Amber Alert to get the community notification out.
Thank you for sharing those. I appreciate it. Again, constantly learning things. I want to shift gears a little bit. We're still running right on time, which is great. We may even end a little early, but to some broader discussions that are. Wow, please excuse my dog. Always right in the middle of a conversation. national consciousness right now is around some very tense conversations about the relationship between law enforcement and different races, including Indigenous people, but more particularly the Black community. So I want to have a conversation about that only and lightly hold that conversation. But the other piece too, I think this is the one that I really want to dig deep into in our time remaining. But
yeah, I'm in a meeting.
Oh, let me start with like, Doug, you've been working in Indigenous communities for a long time. Jason, I'm not sure of your history with your Indigenous community or even what you identify or how you identify, but from your perspective as law enforcement officers, what are we missing in our community? What are the barriers to genuinely addressing violence prevention and response? And, you know, is there anything that you could recommend to us or that we can support you in? Again, this is about collaborations despite tumultuous history. What are you seeing? What recommendations do you have? We're educators, we're lawyers, we're healthcare providers. Like, what do you see? Doug, let's start with you.
Wow, that's quite a question. So there's a lot there that you mentioned, Ty, and I think there are several ways to answer that. First, you know, we as law enforcement officers have a responsibility to serve and protect, and I hope that is the manner in which we conduct ourselves, that we view ourselves as public servants and seek to serve the communities where we're assigned. At the same time, I think the community has a responsibility to provide whatever assistance they can to us and to work with us to try to address these problems. There are so many frustrations because of failed expectations. And, you know, when you talk about missing persons, you know, my heart goes out to the families of the victims. But the fact of the matter is oftentimes they will never be satisfied with the efforts of law enforcement because the outcome is oftentimes or sometimes, you know, a tragic end. And so a lot of times we in law enforcement will never be able to satisfy the desires of the community that we serve in terms of the outcomes of these cases. Where I see room for improvement is across the board. I think we in law enforcement can always strive to do better and to be more understanding and be more communicative. I also think that oftentimes, you know, there's a third entity here, and that is that we're investigators, we're not prosecutors. And as it relates to issues of domestic violence and in the federal system and in the tribal system, you know, we only can go so far. At some point, we have to turn our case over to the prosecutors, and they make decisions that are very important decisions as to how that case is going to be handled. And so they need to be a very big part of this conversation because we turn it over to them at the conclusion of our investigation, and what really happens in terms of charges and sentencing and plea deals or lack thereof is in the hands of the prosecutors. So those are just a few things. And then lastly, what you're doing, Ty, there can't be too much of this type of interaction at every level. And I think the more that we, as human beings, seek to understand one another and talk to one another and share our thoughts, then a lot of those bias and the conflict eases when we communicate and talk to one another and share our various perspectives. So this type of thing that you're doing needs to continue, and I think would pay great dividends in improving the situation.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And again, I appreciate that you're here with us. Jason, how do you feel, or what are your insights about genuinely addressing violence prevention and response in Indigenous communities?
Well, it's going to be kind of hard to follow up what Doug just said. He explained that pretty well, I felt. So I came to the community that I'm currently working in 14 years ago. I'm non-native, and I came into a Native community because I wanted to. I had friends, distant family down here. And, you know, one of the barriers and hurdles that we face in law enforcement, especially in a close community, is becoming a part of it. And it took me several years before some people would even talk to me. You know, after a certain amount of time, which I think is probably the biggest thing you need, is just time and getting people to know you. You know, once people are comfortable with you, then that kind of changes how you can work and how you can address, you know, the violence and how to possibly prevent it and your responses and everything. One thing I try to teach the new guys that get into law enforcement, especially in a tight-knit community like this, is you have to be a part of the community. And some people understand that, some people don't. And you can't make someone, you know, get out there and become a part of a community. And if you don't, it just seems like you don't get that kind of relationship with people. And I unfortunately see that with some officers to this day, that they just don't have that rapport and that relationship to where you could see someone at the grocery store and go up and talk to them. How to fix that beyond being a part of your community and loving and being a part of the area you serve. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how to fix that. I know what I've done personally, and I know it has worked for me, and it's just not something that you can easily teach. So I'm not gonna, I guess, begin to tell how to fix it, because I don't know.
Thank you for even offering an I don't know. That's important. But from my observations, this is what I see. And this is also from my time working with Tyrell Stevenson. He, like both of you as non-natives, and doing your best to learn and serve the community where you work, it is valuable. As an anti-oppression educator, as an anti-racism educator, you have this unique ability now to teach other white folks what you're doing, and teach other non-natives like how you built these relationships, so that we don't have to do it, right? Because we were already, of course, we're standoffish. Of course, we have a tumultuous history with our non-native neighbors. Of course, we have deep-seated trauma that informs our relationships with y'all, especially as law enforcement officers. So that lends itself to the next question about history. I think Hooley's in a unique place because he's a police officer in the community that he grew up in, like that he is already a part of. So, I mean, Hooley, do you have any insight as to how do you overcome the animosity between the community members and law enforcement?
Well, first of all, I was on the other side. I wasn't a police officer all my life. I was arrested in my past, and I actually was a victim of racism. I was arrested basically just because of color. So I think my biggest thing is to teach the people who we are, and to let them know the traumatic history that has happened amongst people of race, people of color. So I've actually worked with Doug Hart, the FBI program out of Lewiston. They actually came out and did a cultural class with us. We developed a cultural class to started working with the community area law enforcement to address those issues, because today it's still happening when we have the animosities between law enforcement and our people, not just ours, but any race, color, people that feel like they're totally prejudiced against. We're speaking for them. We don't want that type of stigma within law enforcement. Yes, it's tough being enrolled member in Nespers Tribe and working in your own country. At the same time, it's a very educational process that gives me the opportunity to be a voice for those tribal members and to educate those other agencies to let them know that that's who we are. As a law enforcement officer and as a chief of police, I still experience those situations. We still have to prove ourselves. We still have to be better than the next person for them to actually trust us. Those things do come out. So it's kind of a nice thing that you're talking about, because again, that's the reason why I do the community policing. Community policing is that we live in both tribal and non-tribal community to gain a trustship where people can trust our department, trust our officers. My program is pretty much predominantly white officers working in Indian country, but to educate them, and as well as for me to be educated about the officers who I hire. One of the things I've learned in life is that if you're going to walk into someone else's house, we need to know about that person. And when they walk into our place, I want to know about them, their background. And I get a very good communicative rapport, and they become a part of us when they get to tell us their story, where they come from, what they've done in the past, their culture, all those kind of things. Then we are able to mold our culture with their culture. So we get to know one another. We don't know each other, then it makes it tough for us to communicate. But it's been really pretty interesting. So right now, also another agency has contacted me and wants to do our cultural program, which is taught by Sergeant John Williamson. And it's an awesome program, but it's something that we can get out to other communities, other law enforcement programs, and to assist as to who we are as a Nespers tribe. And so I think that's very, thanks for that question. Actually, it does happen, and we are trying our best to bridge those gaps.
Thank you for that, Huli. I appreciate it. And it's great to hear that John is doing cultural knowledge training for non-Native agencies. I'm sure that that's actually very beneficial. I did a presentation last week about how we can serve domestic violence response when it's non-Native providers in a Native American community. And it was exactly that, like learning our sovereignty, learning our history, learning our jurisdiction, learning all of the complicated, nuanced history of, you know, racism that exists and prejudice that exists, and still to this day. I think that we can't over address it. Like, we have to have these honest conversations about how implicit bias and racism and prejudice have been insidious in law enforcement agencies. We have to have very honest conversations about that, because I also feel like that is one facet to addressing the violence in Native American communities and prevention and response. If we can't trust that the law enforcement officer who shows up is going to be on our side, is going to show up in a good way, and is going to show up with the cultural knowledge that they need to serve our communities in the best way possible. There was a community member that offered something in the chat, and I think I might leave us with this insight. I think that each of us in all of our agencies and all of our organizations and all of our social circles have an opportunity to really offer knowledge to one another. From a law enforcement standpoint, like, are you educating young people and children and young parents about what happens or what to expect if a relative goes missing? Is the community educated about law enforcement processes and the judicial system and legalese? Like, sometimes the jargon that comes out of prosecutors' offices just goes over everybody's head, and that makes it incredibly inaccessible. When do the handoffs take place from the investigation to the prosecution? Whose roles are what? Who are the victims' advocates? Who is leading the investigation itself? Like, these are all questions that the community wants to know about this process. And they've said it both in our listening sessions, they say it in conversations when I made a call for questions for this event. They're saying it now in the chat. So I really hope that the takeaway for you all as law enforcement officers is that there are needs in the community. There is knowledge. There are knowledge gaps actually that need to be filled. And for the sake of saving lives, we have to find the resources to be able to do it. So with that, I think I will bring us to a close about 10 minutes early. We did cover a lot of material, again, going over history, process, jurisdiction, and communication. Those were the big things I really wanted to touch on. I thank all of you for your insight and the work that you're doing to address this violence in Indigenous communities. I appreciate your partnership and willingness to show up today. That matters a great deal to me, and I hope that we can continue this work moving forward in a collaborative way across the state. And I hope that we have continued expectations for you, but those expectations aren't groundless. We just are trying to save lives, save our babies, save our elders, protect the community, because we have so little left, and that we have to protect it as best as we can. Just a couple of reminders for all of you. Please keep an eye out in your emails for the evaluations for this week. We do have some exciting news. The Boise State University K through 12 professional development program is offering PD credit for your participation. So please keep an eye out in your emails for that. There's also a registration link that I think my tech team sent out to you. So please take advantage of that. We want you to get that professional development credit for the K through 12 program at Boise State University. Let's see, evaluations next week. We don't start, is our last week, our 4th week of the conference. We've made it all the way through week 3. We will be having a discussion about sovereignty and jurisdiction. We are including a voice of Chantel Green, who is the vice chairwoman of the Nez Perce Tribe Executive Committee. We will also have my sister Melanie Fillmore presenting on her research plan, as well as her knowledge of sovereignty, what it is to be a PL 280 state and how that impacts violence. And we're really excited to have Ernie Wayand, who is also an FBI contractor and consultant who's done incredible work in Indian country for nearly 25 years, if I'm not mistaken. So those 3 voices on that panel is on Wednesday. The most important event of this entire conference is next Thursday. The most important event is the voices of our survivors. It is the voices of those most impacted by missing and murdered Indigenous people epidemic. They are brave in showing up to tell their stories to us. And what I hope that we take away is that we've humanized everything that we've learned in the last 3 to 4 weeks. We are putting faces to some of this knowledge, that we are able to understand a new level of compassion. We can lean into that learning and to the vulnerability of what damage this epidemic is doing to Native families and Native people. So please stay with us. We've got 1 more week left. Again, reach out to me if you need me, ty@engagingvoices.org, the schedule at engagingvoices.org. We are certainly happy to have all of you and look forward to seeing you next week. Again, thank you to Jason/Sam/Coeur d'Alene Tribe Law Enforcement. Thank you, Huli, for showing up, of the Nez Perce Tribe Police Department, Tanea of the Idaho State Police Missing Persons Clearinghouse, and Doug of the FBI. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And that'll conclude our afternoon. Thank you so much. Katsiaya yohkalo.